I hadn't realized AIU has completed 98 years. It almost sounds like Donald Bradman's test average. Some of you may know, a few of you may know, that I was born in this part of the country and spent the formative years in this part of the country in Shillong, which was then part of undivided Assam. So I have a certain fondness and a certain weakness for the Northeast. I and my family left many years ago, but every once in a while I do visit Assam and I do visit Meghalaya. And every time we pass Barnihart, every time the road begins to curve upwards to the hills through Debroy district, it seems to me that I'm going home in some sense. I said, as the road curves towards the hills through Debroy district, in the past I have turned to the right. I have not turned sufficiently to the right. And Mahbubul Haq ji, this is my first visit to USTM. As I said, I did not turn sufficiently right. Mahbubul Haq ji, no doubt you know that you share your name with a very famous Pakistani economist named Mahbubul Haq. Mahbubul Haq did a lot to measure human development, particularly through the UN. I hope after my visit to USTM, what will happen is this particular Mahbubul Haq will not measure human development, but do something to improve it in this particular region. Many years ago, I used to work in the university system. Today, I am an outsider. I have nothing directly to do with the university system. So any remarks that I make are those of an outsider and treat it no more than that. The Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister also indirectly is concerned with higher education, not directly, and hence again, whatever I am going to say are in the nature of my personal remarks and bulleted thoughts. They should not be interpreted as a profound piece of policy advice that the Economic Advisory Council has delivered to the Prime Minister. India is a young country. Of course it is. India will not remain a young country forever. India will also age beyond 2035. India is going through what economists and development policy experts call demographic transition, which results in a temporary bulge in the young population. In every country in the world, whenever there has been this demographic transition, whenever the percentage of the young people in the population has gone up, that has led to a demographic dividend, which means a certain increment to GDP growth, a certain increment to productivity. In many countries in the world, that increment to GDP growth has been of the order of 2.5%. In India, it has been of the order of 1.5%. So to state the obvious, in India we have not benefited as much from the demographic dividend as we ought to have. As we set out the template for Amrit Kaal, as we think of the next 25 years, it is therefore important to ask the question about what must be done to ensure that we do not miss that window of opportunity, and what must the higher education system do. Whether you tap the demographic dividend or not is a function of whether that young population and the population in general has access to health outcomes and educational outcomes. In the not too distant past, like many countries in the world, India was also exposed to a completely exogenous crisis thrust upon us in the form of the COVID pandemic. And compared to the dire prognosis that was articulated by many people in the West, we have done remarkably well in terms of handling that pandemic. Whether it is in mortality terms, whether it is in terms of vaccination terms, or in terms of recovery from the effects of the pandemic. That's on the health side. But here we are assembled today to talk not about health, we are here to talk about education. Dr. Pegu mentioned the question of silos. There are silos in education also, silos that we have historically created in the past. There is the preschool part of it, there is the school part of it, there is the vocational part of it, and there is the higher education part of it. Education cannot be a silo, either from the point of view of policy or from the point of view of regulator or from the point of view of development. Much of what happens to a child is actually determined often at the prenatal state, while the child is still in the womb. Much of what that student does when he or she enrolls in a course of higher education is determined by what he or she was taught in kindergarten. And what have we been taught in kindergarten as a student? You shall not question why. You will never ask why. The teacher is right. The textbook is right. The examination system is right. So we do not allow the student to ask questions, and then we expect that student to go out and compete in the wide world where from day one the student in Western educational systems is allowed to question. There is also the question of skills, mentioned by Dr. Pegu. There is a correlation between skills and educational development, but it's not an automatic correlation. So yes, indeed, we should ask ourselves, is the educational system delivering skills? And when I say delivering skills, each one of us individually possesses some skill or the other. That's not what we are talking about. What we are talking about is skills as delivered and valued by the market. And certainly it is the case that in general the educational system, and this is a point I will come back to, has not quite delivered the skills. I don't know what the exact figures are now. The figures I read from the All India Survey on Higher Education are somewhat old. I presume the figures will have been updated. In terms of higher education, we have a very heterogeneous basket. Part of the reason being the way the higher education system evolved in India. So we have affiliating universities, we have non-affiliating universities, we have colleges of different kinds, and we have roughly, Dr. Mittal will promptly correct me if I am wrong, we have roughly about 1100 universities, roughly about 45,000 colleges, and roughly about 12,000 other institutions. 20% of those colleges have an enrollment less than 100. 62% of those colleges have enrollment less than 500. 3,500 have enrollment less than 50. Whatever be the number, there must be a certain benchmark level of enrollment that is necessary for an institution of higher education to be viable. Perhaps it's 3,000. That's not the point I'm making. That is for you to decide. The point I'm making is, we talk about the National Education Policy 2020 and you will talk about it. Perhaps because it's a government document, it does not mention exit. It mentions exit for students exiting from one program to another, but I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is the fact that the National Education Policy 2020 is about liberalization, is about competition, which is desirable. Because competition imparts efficiency. Competition is beneficial to the consumer, in this particular case the student, but the point I'm making is, and I did not see a technical session on this, perhaps because it is undiplomatic, many of these institutions of higher education will have to close down, full stop. It has happened in every sector. It is bound to happen in this sector. So we need to think of an exit policy for institutions of higher education, an exit policy for the faculty, an exit policy for the infrastructure. Yes, you might say, gross enrollment ratios in higher education have gone up, as they should. I think they're about 27% now, if it is the 18 to 23 age group. Yes, if I make comparisons with countries in East Asia, the gross enrollment ratio in higher education should be higher. Perhaps it should be 50%, but even if one does that, many of these institutions, existing institutions, will be unviable. I don't know how many of you know, the rate of population growth in India is actually slowing down. It's about 0.8%. There has been a reduction in the absolute number of children in the 0 to 15 age group, not percentage. The absolute number of children in the 0 to 15 age group has come down, which means we planned for an increasing population. We now have to plan for a reduced population, not only for schools, and many states have rationalized dysfunctional schools. We will also have to plan for a rationalization of existing institutions of higher education. The next point I want to touch on is, because this is about globalization, indirectly or directly, it's also about the world rankings. I'm not going to get into the Times Higher Education and the QS. The fact of the matter is, our institutions of higher education do not do that well. Yes, there will be the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Yes, there will be Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. There will be some IITs, and therefore there will also be some universities, including Jadavpur. The question I'm posing before you is a question of deliberately targeting the rankings. Because the rankings are based on certain variables. Some of it is about infrastructure, but some of it is about overseas faculty, some of it is about overseas students. I'm not going to mention China because China has all kinds of different things, but there was a deliberate targeting by a country like Singapore to deliberately address the variables that figure in those rankings with a deliberate intention to improve the rankings. So amongst other things, in conformity with the indicators used in these rankings, the incentive structure for faculty members was initially publication in refereed journals, but then it moved to citations. The next point I want to make is about regulation. Of course we need regulation. The issue is not that. The issue is what is the content of that regulation. And quite often people complain about excessive strangleholds on the part of government in terms of that regulation. Typically government reacts, or even parliament reacts in terms of tight regulation whenever that self-regulation is lacking. Education, including higher education, is a sector where there is a complete asymmetry of information between the provider, whom you represent, and to the person who's demanding it, the students and the parents. I think a substantive content of that regulation will have to be in terms of dissemination of information. What are the qualifications of faculty, their CVs, publication records, citation records, placements, indeed revenue and expenditure. And I think on all of this today, there is not a sufficient amount of transparency. Which takes me to another issue, and that issue is that of the private universities or the private sector in higher education, and USTM represents one of those. The public versus private debate is an old one. It's not a debate that happens only in India, it happens in other countries in the world, except that in India, governments, union and state, they are starved for both fiscal resources and administrative and governance capacity. And therefore every economist will argue that the externalities, the positive externalities are greater for primary education. And since there are opportunity costs of resources, the government's limited resources are best spent on school education rather than higher education. There is of course the more important question of the form that public funding takes. I was born in Shillong, but I am a Bengali. At the turn of the 20th century, there was a famous, Shranjan, I'm not very sure whether I should call him a chemist, whether I should call him an entrepreneur. He was all of that and more, and this was Acharya Prafulla Chandra Ray, who studied at the University of Edinburgh. And I read his autobiography, if my recollection serves me right. It was in 3 volumes. It was called Life and Experience of a Bengali Chemist. When I read it many years ago, I was struck by one particular incident. And Acharya Prafulla Chandra Ray describes almost a cultural shock he faced when he went to the University of Edinburgh. The University of Edinburgh had no student fees. There were no tuition fees. You attended a lecture. If you are happy with the lecture as you walked out, you left on that desk whatever you thought the lecture was worth. And the salaries of the lecturers came from that. The reason it has a bearing on the earlier point is I talked about the form that public funding takes. There is public funding that can be to the institution, and there is public funding that can go to the student in the form of scholarships. There is a difference between funding a student who deserves it, perhaps through something targeted like SECC, and the difference between funding infrastructure or revenue expenditure for public institution. I told you I was born in Shillong, spent the first years of my schooling in Shillong. Since then, the reason I am here today is because my education was funded throughout by scholarships, some of which was government at different levels. And Shuranjan also is a beneficiary of some of those scholarships. Hence, there is an issue, given that fiscal resources from the government are going to be scarce. There is an issue of generating alternative funds, whether it is the corporate sector, whether it is alumni, because fundamentally that the higher fees will come from the professional courses. And every institution of higher education has to do a little bit of cross-subsidization for courses that would otherwise not be viable, and also has to develop, in addition to what I said about the government, its own system of scholarships and its own system of financial aid for students. I'm now turning towards what I think is my most provocative statement. Some of you may not know. Well, the reason I've been calling him Shuranjan is that we were classmates with different subjects in the same college. In its heyday, one of the best places for undergraduate education, not only in India but in anywhere in the world, and that is Presidency College, Kolkata. I have been a teacher for the bulk of my life. And as a student in Presidency College, and Dr. Suranjan Das will also testify to that, we've had the best of teachers. What does the teacher do? Our great teachers in Presidency College in those days, this was much before UGC at that time, tightened up the requirements. You need to have an MPhil, you need to have a PhD, you need to have publications. Those teachers were simply great teachers, full stop. They may not have a great research record, but they were simply great teachers. They were teachers who were great because teaching is essentially interactive. In our Guru Shishya Parampara, it was Guru with one Shishya. Maybe that is an extreme. As statisticians, we talk about normal curves or bell curves, or we talk about Pareto curves. For every teacher, there is the question, am I teaching to the top 20% or the top 5%? Or am I teaching to everyone else? And the answer is a little bit of both. For a while, I happened to teach in the National University of Singapore. And I always had a problem. the National University of Singapore to tell me where is the PPT. I would say, what PPT? Where do you want a PPT? A PPT constrains me. It doesn't allow me to make the teaching interactive. If you're going to have the PPT, you don't need me. Just circulate the PPT. And this is the provocative point I'm making, that if I'm not, just as there's a distribution of students in terms of the bell curve or the Pareto curve, I'm sorry to say there is a distribution of teachers also. Rare is the teacher, we had some of those in Presidency College, rare is the teacher who belongs to the top 5% or the 10%. And if you are the rest, I think we need to recognize, and Dr. Mittal, you don't have a session on that because you are ducking, I think, unavoidable questions. I don't know whether you have a session on that or not, which is the conventional teachers will simply become redundant. If I am going to do the AI, artificial intelligence will take over. If I do not, as a teacher, exercise my human intelligence, artificial intelligence will come along and will say, we don't need this kind of teaching. There will be digital tools, there will be digital universities, there will be digital gurus. If AI is doing Shakespeare, if AI is being used in jurisprudence, it will happen for teachers also. Many teachers, I'm not talking about the ones here, they are exceptions. They recycle notes year after year. And of course, there is a question of an examination system also. I was a professor at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. I wanted to introduce a system of open book exams. Open book exams, as every teacher will testify, taxes not only students, it taxes teachers also. And guess what? The greatest opposition came from the faculty members. So not only are we talking about an exit policy for institutions of higher education, we are also talking about an exit policy for teachers. Teachers who do not adapt. And there are the silos. A different kind of silo. If you think of Boston, Boston is an educational center because not only are there famous institutions of higher education, there they collaborate with each other, there are research collaborations with industry. You think of Delhi, I have the liberty to speak about Delhi because I live there. Not a single university talks to another one. Well, NEP permits that, but as of today they don't talk to each other. The research institutes don't talk to each other. In the cause of transforming India, that kind of silo must also end. There is no reason on earth why Meghalaya should not become a center for education and higher education in this part of the country. I see the beginnings of it now. The motto of AIU puzzled me a little bit. Sanghat sanjayate sandhihi. Both words being used in extremely specialized senses. So there is the Sanghat, and of course there is the Sandhi. Sandhi also means a cusp. We are at a cusp. And I congratulate USTM and AIU for having organized this manthan, this churn, because we need to figure out that Sandhi at this cusp. Sandhi is also the cusp from one era to another. We began with Saraswati Vandana. This is about Saraswati Vandana. We sang the national anthem. Jayatu Bharatan, Jayatu Bharati.